Okay, John the Baptist. He baptized people. Okay.
He was a cousin.
He was a cousin to Jesus, yes. He was more of the Essene branch of Jewish people. There's three main groups of Jewish people. There's the Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. Okay, the Pharisees are the ones that we mostly hear about. They were the ones who sort of ran the temple and were faithful in that way. Pharisees. The Sadducees were Jewish descent people, but they were sort of not the really churchy people. That's the easy way to say it. They were more worldly. The one group were more in name Jewish than they were in practicing. And then the Essenes are the ones who lived in the wilderness. That's what John the Baptist was. He was one who lived in the wilderness. You know, you read about these people out kind of odd, had their little...
Eating locusts?
Yeah, eating the locusts, whatever that was. Different things you read about that is, was it bugs? There was a locust tree, so did he eat from that? So he wandered around and preached Jesus as the Messiah. And in the Old Testament, we have the prophets who wandered around and people made fun of them, and they did things to grab attention that were kind of odd, like living in the wilderness like John the Baptist did. Probably not quite as odd as some of those prophets, though. We stick with him a little more. Okay, so John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin. He was born like 6 months before Jesus. I believe Mary went to visit Elizabeth when she found out she was pregnant, and we hear that Elizabeth was about 6 months pregnant, and that John recognized Jesus right away by jumping in her womb when Mary came with Jesus there. But there's not a lot about him in Scripture, and yet he was Jesus' cousin. And we have just certain stories that are kind of big, but then we don't hear about them much anymore. So I thought it would be fun for us to look up the references and to find out, do we learn anything new about him, or are we repetitive when we go to the different Gospels? John the Baptist kind of is like Malachi in the Old Testament. Okay, Malachi was a person who he was a messenger. So he went out, I printed out a thing just for me. Malachi is the book of the Bible, and in Hebrew, Malachi means my messenger. See, I am sending my messenger. The messenger is Malachi. Most scholars assume the author of this book took Malachi as a pen name. In a double sense, Malachi is the messenger bringing us the book, Malachi, and his message is that God will send another messenger in the future as the great prophet Elijah returning before the day of the Lord. Okay, it's not Elijah who comes again to be, but it's John. So John comes to prepare the way for Jesus. Whereas Malachi was preparing the way a long, long time ago, you know, they kept preparing the way for the Messiah, and the Messiah didn't come, didn't come, didn't come. Half the time they were looking for the Messiah to be a king, to come in and to be the new superpower in the world that would come in and get rid of whoever they were under the rule of. Because we know that the Jewish people, the children of Israel, really, once the Babylonians came and took over, which was the time of Ezekiel, from there on, Isaiah, the second half, they've been under the superpower, the children of Israel, or the Jewish people, for always, until, 1957, I think, when they became a country again. So they've been under the domination of the Babylonians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies from Egypt, the Syrian Seleucids, and then Rome up through Jesus. So that they were under the Roman rule, same thing with John the Baptist. So really the Jewish people struggled a lot being under the domination of somebody almost all the time. Okay, that's Malachi. What I did is I went through and I collected all the verses that are about John the Baptist, which are limited, one page, and then some questions that we can talk about afterwards. And then there are traits of the Messiah. I think we should do that one first, the traits of the Messiah, because if John the Baptist is sent to prepare the way for the Messiah, we need to know about the Messiah so we know what he's telling people. Does that make sense? So, lots of Bible stuff to look up, but we can split it, and you can look it up and then figure out what the traits and the work are of the Messiah. So, somebody want to take Isaiah 11, 1-5? Thank you. All right, we'll just start over here. Dave and Dottie, do that one. Matt, you can do Isaiah 40. Jim, do Isaiah 35. The one that's the third one down. Okay, Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. And Jean, you want to do Zephaniah? Or Karen, you can look up Matthew 11. Okay, so let's come up with traits and work of the Messiah. Isaiah 11, 1-5.
A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins.
So half of that's very familiar. The beginning part, we get that at Christmas. We know that part. Gets a little more in depth than we're kind of used to reading on the other stuff. Okay, so this is what the Messiah is going to do. Wisdom, understanding, knowledge, all of those things, and then using the breath, which would be his words, he would attack the people who were wrong with his words. Attack's a little strong, but in reality, yes. Okay? Equity for the meek. That's not a phrase we hear very often, is it?
Mm-mm.
It's leveling the playing field for everyone.
Yeah. And sometimes the meek and the mild, and we hear that at Christmas too. Sometimes I think we, in my mind, when it first starts, I'm always thinking the poor. But it doesn't necessarily mean the poor. It means the people who don't stand up for themselves, don't know how to do that. So, you know, if some kid is being picked on and doesn't know how to stand up for himself, there he is, the meek, being affected. Sometimes when we read these, we need to stop and think, okay, so who else fits under this? Not just those people, but in our time. There's a lot of meek people.
Get something.
Yeah. See, that's the wonderful thing about actually doing a little Bible study like this. You all have different helps in your Bible that, you know, I've got 6 different Bibles and they all tell you something different. Okay, anything else on that one that you want to share? All right, let's move on then. Isaiah 40, 9-11.
Get up, or get you up, the high mountain of Zion, herald of good tidings, and lift up your voice with strength. Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord God come with might, and his arm rules for him. His reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed the flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep.
Okay, and I'm wondering how many of these are going to be from Christmas? Because as Handel's Messiah, what we're hearing, those words about the Messiah that's coming have been put together so beautifully by Handel that we know them. Which when you stop and think about it, how many people who don't enjoy the fine arts miss a lot? That's why the choir sings a lot of different stuff to touch people in a lot of different ways. And, okay. So what else from that one? He shall feed his flock, also from Messiah, but also from just Jesus being a shepherd and taking care of his sheep. You know, there's the taking care of your sheep. The sheep would go into a pen and they had a doorway, and a lot of times there would be different herds that would be out on the hills together. So when the shepherds would bring them back in for the night to protect them, there was usually like a stone wall with a doorway in it. And oftentimes, one shepherd would stand over the hole in the gate, or the gate, and call by name his sheep, because his sheep recognized him as the shepherd, so he could get his sheep into safety, and then the next one would stand and get his sheep in. I don't quite know how they did that well, because sheep are really stupid, and usually when one starts to move, they all follow. If you know any farmers who have raised sheep, they don't really have anything good to say about them. But the fact that Jesus says, I am the shepherd, my sheep knows my voice, my sheep follow me, we hear that from Jesus, and then here we have it in the Old Testament. So we have these Old Testament things that lead us, and John the Baptist is the biggest leader for Jesus. So when we find out what it is that the Messiah is supposed to do when the Messiah comes, and that's what John the Baptist tells people. Okay? Not always so well. Okay. Any other comments on that one? I just love reading Isaiah.
This is a happier, more comforting than
Yep.
the previous.
Yeah.
I think sheep farmers of the day now probably don't spend a lot of time with their sheep, so they probably don't recognize the voice that well.
Right.
Whereas I think back then, they spent all day out there with the
Yeah.
sheep. They probably weren't always quiet, they probably were talking or singing or something, the sheep probably recognized that, right?
Playing their harp. Little David, play on your harp.
Whatever.
No? Yeah. I mean, how would you entertain yourself out there all day long?
And, Jesus too spent time with his sheep, right? Think about the people that followed him around and spoke to them.
Yeah, and we read some places that 70 people ended up being with Jesus, like, all the time when he was traveling, but we know that there were a whole lot more people that traveled with him, more than just that kind of steady 70. So can you imagine a little town, like even say Bethlehem, all of a sudden, here comes Jesus walking in with all these sheep following him who were humans? I'm drawing a blank. Do we talk about David as being a shepherd of his people, or just King David? I can't think of any specific shepherding ones. Yeah. And that's the caregiver. You do everything when you're a shepherd. You're out by yourself. Maybe you join up with another flock somewhere, but basically the loneliest, rottenest job. That's what they say when Jesus is born. They go to the shepherds, the least among everyone, to tell them the good news first. The good news is for everyone. You're not excluded. You're the first ones we're telling. Okay, Isaiah 35, 3 and 4.
Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you.
So hers said retribution instead of recompense.
I think what I got out of this was how many times Jesus said, do not fear.
Do not fear. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And how many times do we say that to people? It's okay. Don't be afraid. Especially little ones that are growing up.
Children, yes.
Yeah, we say it all the time. Don't be afraid. It's okay. Someone will be there with you. Or
you can do this.
yeah. Or for me, having just done, sorry, I'm clicking the microphone. Oops. We just had a funeral of a friend's son, and don't be afraid, he committed suicide, and so, so many people wanna fix it for him. Well, there isn't a fix, it's what happened, but that doesn't mean he's not with God. It just means that he had demons, is what he kept calling them. I have these demons and I can't win. They just keep staying with me, I don't know how to get rid of them. So it's that thing too, not just children, don't be afraid, you can do this, but adults, parents, all of us. We don't need to be afraid of what's going on because it may seem like people are coming after us, but our strength is in the Lord and we need to remember that. Whatever they're coming after us for, we don't have to face it alone. I guess maybe that's what I'm thinking. Okay, anything else? Okay, are we ready for the next one? 61, 1 and 2.
This one's very easy. It's called The Good News of Deliverance. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Day of deliverance.
Okay. Old Testament stuff that shows up in the New Testament. When we catch that, so often,
Think how hard it was to pass along words in those days too. They didn't have printing presses
yeah,
or
yeah.
universities.
And they came on big scrolls.
Yeah.
Because it says the scroll was opened, that means a lot of papyrus.
Written by a person who had to hear it from another person, and we think it would get changed.
That's God's work,
Yeah, right.
keeping it the way it belongs.
Pure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to think back to how all this stuff made it up through Jesus and then made it past Jesus up to us. I mean, we just open our phone and it's right there.
That's right.
And you can change the font, you can make it so you can read it. There's all kinds of stuff that we can do now that, wow. Plus, how many different translations do we have? When you read the Old King James, you're lost because it's so flowery. And then you read the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is the one we read in church, and it's hard because that's the hardest one, it's the closest one. And then you can get some of these, like I have the kids' study Bible, the NIV. Really helps a lot because sometimes you're reading and you're like, and you don't want to quit. But then reading all the helps at the bottom doesn't really help read it. when you get those with all the helps, they're wonderful for understanding, but not for reading. Somewhere along the line, I was told that the translations, you know, now, we can't count them now, but like, let's say, go to 50 years ago, whatever the main translation was, there are so few errors in them from people copying over and over and over again, that the Bible is like the most unique book ever. Even the philosophers, you know, there's a lot of philosophers which, you know, I didn't realize that the philosophers, Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were all way before Jesus. You know, that, when I got that, I went, whoa, I didn't realize hundreds of years before Jesus when he came. I mean, I knew Paul liked to talk philosophically, but wow, I didn't know they were there. But the Bible has had almost no errors in translating, whereas all these philosophers and stuff, you know, you can read 4 different descriptions of what they were trying to say, because they were never copied the same. Somebody else would copy it and change it the way they liked it, but Scripture hasn't had that happen to it. Okay, Zephaniah 3, 14 to 20.
Okay. Sing aloud, O daughter Zion, shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has turned away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall fear disaster no more. On that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will renew you in his love. He will exult over you with loud singing as on a day of festival. I will remove the disaster from you so that you will not bear reproach for it. I will deal with all your oppressors at that time, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast. And I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you home, at the time when I gather you, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord.
Wow. That's what we need to hear, isn't it? I mean, that was just like, I'm all for you,
Yes, yes.
and I'm coming.
Don't worry, I'm coming.
All those things. Who knew Zephaniah had things like that?
But the flip side, I guess I had a sentence about him being a warrior who gives victory. Couldn't that be part of the reason that the Jews didn't recognize him? Because he didn't really come in on a stallion and crush, you know, the people, or I mean, the oppressors. I mean,
Yeah, but he was a warrior with words.
true.
So we never think that, though. Not the fisticuffs to men. We can men walk softly and don't carry the big sticks.
Well, the other thing I see here, and I don't know if this is stretching it too much, but as I look at verse 20, at that time I will gather you, at that time I will bring you home. Could this even be talking about a second wonderful warrior?
Could, you know, they're bringing the people home from being captive, but it's a much bigger picture. Because at this point in time, we're waiting for the Messiah to bring us home, and then we're waiting for the Messiah to come and free us from the Romans, or whoever the rule is, because they're always under somebody's rule. So bring us home, kick the rest of the people out. That's the message. And then ultimately our home in heaven. So we can pull all kinds of stuff from these verses because we know more and make it all comforting for us. Because it's a lot like the other ones. Okay, other comments on that one? Okay, we got one more, Matthew 11, 2-6.
When John heard in prison that what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me."
Okay. New Testament, Jesus sending back to John, when John says, "Are you really?" I mean, I grew up with you. That's another hard thing to picture, that he and John were cousins. I grew up with you. I know how you throw a football. I mean, you know, it's hard to separate them. Can you imagine what John went through when all of a sudden Jesus is something else, and John knows that he's out baptizing people to be faithful, but I'm not doing it as well as, or like Jesus will? Must have been a super confusing life for him, for any family of Jesus. Sometimes when you think about that, it's even hard sometimes sharing with other family members about your faith. I know there are some people who have relatives that go to a different church and who are very opinionated one way, and are we very opinionated another way, or are we graceful when we chat with them? When we put them down and say, "You're wrong"? You know, it's really hard to have discussions with other people. You know, it's really hard to have a conversation with somebody who has a wall put up. And yet think of all these people that John's talking to, and that Jesus talks to, and all his disciples. How many people are active in the church, the synagogue? They know the rules, they know the laws, all those things. Paul ran into those troubles too, because Jesus is the new way, and the old way doesn't really count anymore. All of those things were how we have to cut our hair and cook our food and do all those rules that are in Leviticus. I'm glad we don't have to do that anymore. Mm-hmm.
This is another instance to me of how doubting or not being quite sure about something isn't necessarily wrong. We talk about Thomas all the time and doubting Thomas, and is that really bad? It's natural, I think.
Yeah,
Like you
and
said, it's the kid you grew up with, and can you believe that's what he turned out?
I mind my P's and Q's when I'm around here now. No more punching when we meet. Yeah. It is interesting, isn't it, how we picture all these people that we read about, and then when we read something about how they lived, it's kind of a whole different, because you never, you always just think there's Jesus walking on water and the disciples are with him, because they're the good guys. Even though we read and we know they're human, it's still hard to imagine that they could be human like me and still be with Jesus. That's the hard part, I think. It's like, yeah, I'm pretty good, but I just wonder how it would be. Then I share every now and then, there was a video, I think it was the book of Matthew, but they had this really cute Jesus instead of the emaciated looking ones that we see so often in the Easter movies. This was this really cute guy, and he and the disciples were walking along the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and they were bumping each other and horsing around, and you're like, yes, that's my Jesus. He's a buddy too. He's not floating up here with the statue like we see so often. He's a real person. He gets horsing around and having a good time as well as the rest of life. And so John the Baptist must have had a great life growing up with Jesus. I mean, probably straightened out every now and then, you know, but didn't we all have a cousin or a relative that, you want me to tell your mom what you're doing right now? I got that a couple times. Not too many though, because I was afraid that you would. Okay, enough of that. Sidetracked again, which I do well. Okay, next page. I think doing the Isaiah verses on the back of whatever page I'm on would be more beneficial to us than doing the John the Baptist stuff on the front page. You can do those, look them up, a lot of them are the same, and they're gonna tell us about him, how he had doubts about Jesus. Remember when John was in prison? And he said, are you really the one? Are you really doing things that you say you're doing? So I think it's kind of interesting to check those, but I also think some of these other verses that we have are, let's go to Luke 3, 7 to 18. And we'll divide that up. So 7 to 9, 12 to 13, and 14 to 18. Okay, Luke 3, 7 to 18. Who would like to read that?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
John said to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruits worthy of repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now the axe is lying at the root of the tree. Every tree, therefore, does not bear good fruit, is cut down and thrown into the fire. And the crowds asked him, what then should we do? In reply, he said to them, whoever has 2 coats must share with everyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise. Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, teacher, what should we do? He said to them, collect no more than the amount prescribed for you. Soldiers also asked him, and we, what should we do? He said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusations, and be satisfied with your wages. How far? 18, you said?
Mm-hmm.
As the people were filled with expectation and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John, whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to you untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So with many other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news to the people. End of reading.
Here ends the reading. Okay, so John addresses the crowd. They've counted on their religious ties and their national ties to keep them in good standing with God. What does John's message say to us today?
Could get into politics here.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Well,
Certain candidate that came to mind.
we don't even have to get into politics. We can just say we are very alienated as people. We all know what we think is right. So how do we determine what's right and what's not right? And how do we live according to that?
Or we think as Americans, we are right.
We do. And are we? Sometimes. Yeah, some sometimes.
Donna and I talked about this last night. I say there will be a revolution to change things. How can you change?
You've been saying
things-
that for 40 years.
How can you change things with social media without having a revolution?
Social media has changed things. I don't know, good, bad, or indifferent, or we're just aware of more people's opinions because of social media. We're always gonna have
children and grandchildren though. I mean, you figure we're old, we'll probably get through whatever it is, but our kids and our grandkids and
Yeah, because it seems to me, when I was a kid, things were awful, you know? And before that was the Depression, things were awful.
Yeah,
So,
there have been awful times always.
yeah, wars and rumors of wars,
Yeah.
we always have that,
Panic, yeah.
and injustice.
parents and grandparents still worrying probably the whole time.
Mhm. Yeah, raising kids because whatever else is happening.
Well, you know, we want our children to learn how to seek the truth, and that's a never-ending thing. You're always going to need to hear what people are saying and then determine for yourself what is the truth. So you always need to expect to hear lies. It's part of our life.
Which on the one hand is even more frightening,
Events and, yeah.
because when you're getting something on social media, who are you getting it from?
Yeah.
And who do you trust? Because they've got the stuff readily available. But I think probably right, the filter is there because they've grown up with it.
Yes.
You know, it's been around them a lot longer than us. We're still like, should I believe this, should I not, what should I do? You know, I didn't know that, ooh, that's terrible, and they're probably like, yeah,
Yeah.
delete, yeah,
Right.
delete. And hopefully their roots are strong enough to handle all this stuff, and that they will raise their kids
It's a different.
with strong roots too. I mean, we worry, but I think we always worry about,
Mhm.
are they paying attention, those young ones?
That's the issue though, isn't it? Whether they are discarding everything because they've been, if you want to call it tricked or lied to so much, and are they just going with the music and the movie stars and all that kind of stuff? And that's where you're talking about the roots, are they strong enough?
Yeah. And I guess, in a sense,
Sometimes.
that's our responsibility. And hopefully we passed it on,
Mhm.
for that responsibility to be fair
Do
and
your best
faithful.
and trust God, yeah.
A lot of prayer. The world needs a lot of prayer right now. Okay. That was a good discussion. National ties. Okay, let's go to verse 14. The soldiers and the lover of power. Luke 3, verse 14. Then some soldiers asked John, "And what should we do?" John replied, "Don't force people to give you money. Don't bring false charges against people. Be happy with your pay." What do we say to that? Soldiers came to John. They were lovers of power. Their weapons and authority they had from the government gave them power over other people. Their goal was more power. What are some ways that we can use threats or authority over others to get our way? What does John say to us about hungering for power? The worst case is what you're living under right now, really. But you still have your synagogue. You still have your neighbors and family in your neighborhood. They usually didn't intrude on that. And then, you know, it just depended who was in power and who directed what they needed to do. And when you're in the army, you don't have a whole lot of choice except for on your time, you can be a good person. I'm sure many were. And isn't this the thing that we need to be so careful of, that we don't stereotype everything? Okay, well, in the military here, you know, they were, but were they?
People.
Yeah, they were people too. And that's what we do, we still do. we lump everybody together and say, oh, those people.
I have to tell you, my son was 26 years in the Navy, so I'm kind of,
Well, we got 20 years here, and our boys are career Air Force, so,
are they? Yes, yes.
yeah. And I'd like to think that they're
Well, I
okay.
don't think they're, yeah, I don't think he's power hungry or anything. It was.
And there are power-hungry military people, there are power-hungry politicians, there are power-hungry people in banks, there are power-hungry people everywhere.
Power hungry clergy.
Yes, exactly.
Sure, yeah.
That's me.
Right, that's right.
Doesn't it just ooze right out of me? Yeah, every profession, every neighborhood.
Yeah.
There's always somebody that you're like, oh, again? Yeah, but it's part of our job to be grace-filled like Jesus was. And like Don preached to everyone else, follow this person who's coming after me. He's the real deal. Okay, well, there are other verses that John is in. I printed out all of them. The one page has them according to topic, so you can kind of look at the according to topic ones and keep a reference, look it up if you're interested in that, because we're out of time. Thanks for coming, thanks for talking.